The Tower of London, summer 1483. The city had been preparing for weeks. Banners had been commissioned. Streets had been cleared of waste and filth. Fresh rushes had been laid on the floors of the great halls. Coins had been ordered from the mint, pressed with the face of a boy. A 12-year-old face, already solemn, carrying something heavy in the eyes. His name was Edward. He was the King of England. On June 22, 1483, the people of London expected to watch him crowned. They never were. Before that date, Edward V and his younger brother Richard stopped being seen. They had been placed inside the Tower of London, traditional lodging for kings before coronation. They were put there for protection. The walls were thick. Guards were stationed at every entrance. No unauthorized person could pass through without being stopped and questioned. And yet, sometime in the summer of that year, the boys disappeared. No bodies, no escape route, no credible witness willing to speak clearly. Just two children, inside England's most fortified building, surrounded by soldiers, then silence. That silence has lasted over 500 years. Every generation has found the same thing. Enough evidence to suspect, not enough to convict. Enough threads to follow, but no thread that leads cleanly to the truth without passing through doubt. This is that story. The full story. Not just the disappearance, but everything that built toward it. The power struggle, the coup, the legal manipulation, the silenced witnesses, and the discoveries that emerged long after. Because this story did not end in 1483. It is still not ended. To understand what happened to Edward V, you must first understand what England was. This was not a kingdom at peace. England in 1483 was a kingdom that had spent 30 years consuming itself in a dynastic civil war. Two branches of the same royal family had been fighting for the throne with an intensity that had blurred the line between politics and murder. Kings had been deposed. Kings had been killed in battles and in prison cells. Alliances had shifted so many times that powerful men had learned not to trust even blood relatives entirely. Loyalty was not a virtue in the England of 1483. It was a calculation. Edward IV, the boy's father, had navigated all of this with a combination of force, intelligence, and political flexibility. He had fought his way to the crown as a young man, lost it briefly, won it back, and then spent the last 12 years building a stable kingdom. He had enemies, but he managed them. He had rivals, but he outlived most of them. He was 40 years old. He was expected to reign for another 2 decades. On the 9th of April, 1483, he died unexpectedly. The illness had lasted only a few weeks. No one saw it coming. 1 week he was a king in his prime. The next he was feverish and declining. And then he was simply gone, and 12-year-old Edward was suddenly the most important person in the kingdom. That transition from Edward IV to Edward V did not just create a child king. It created a power vacuum. And into a power vacuum in medieval England rushed every man with the reach and the ambition to fill it. The question was not whether young Edward would rule. He was the legitimate heir, acknowledged by Parliament and by the Church. The question was who would govern in his name while he was too young to govern himself. Who would be the Lord Protector? The man who held the real authority of the crown until the boy was old enough to exercise it. There were 2 answers, and they could not both be right. Edward IV's will named his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector. Richard was 30 years old, a capable soldier and administrator. He had been loyal to his brother throughout his reign. He was the obvious choice by bloodline and by the dead king's written word. But the royal council, dominated heavily by the family of the boy's mother, Elizabeth Woodville, had different intentions. The Woodvilles had been powerful during Edward IV's reign. Elizabeth's brother Anthony, Earl Rivers, had governed the young prince's household at Ludlow. Her sons from her first marriage held offices and lands across England. Her family had accumulated influence steadily for 20 years. And now, with a 12-year-old king and a protectorate up for grabs, that influence could become something far greater. The Woodvilles moved immediately. They arranged for young Edward to travel from Ludlow to London for his coronation. They set the date. They prepared the escort. They planned to crown the boy before Richard could assert the protectorate. Because a crowned king, even a child, technically did not need a protector. What they didn't realize was that Richard had already been warned. Lord William Hastings, a powerful nobleman close to Edward IV, distrusted the Woodvilles intensely. He sent word to Richard at Middleham Castle, telling him what was being arranged and to move quickly. Richard moved quickly. On April 29, 1483, the young king's party traveled south through Northamptonshire. Richard intercepted them at Stony Stratford. He dined the evening before with Anthony Woodville, Earl Rivers. Rivers, Edward's uncle and guardian, had no reason to expect what came next. The following morning, Richard had him arrested. Rivers was seized, along with Sir Richard Grey, and taken north under armed guard. The 12-year-old King Edward V protested, watching his uncle and half-brother led away. He said he trusted those men, and that they had served him well. Richard told him he was being protected from men who intended to control him. He then escorted Edward to London himself. The arrest at Stony Stratford is often presented as the beginning of Richard's coup. It reveals exactly how power operates in such situations. Rivers and Grey had done nothing that morning that could be called a crime. They were escorting the rightful king to his coronation. Richard's justification was a claimed Woodville conspiracy to seize control of the boy. No evidence of this plot was ever produced in a court of law. Rivers and Grey sat in Pontefract Castle for 2 months. Then, on June 25th, they were executed, not tried, executed. You do not execute men without trial for a plot you claim to have prevented. You execute men for what they know or for what they might say if given the chance to speak. This was the first indication that something else was happening, something that required the silencing of witnesses before it was fully executed. Young Edward arrived in London on May 4th. His mother, Elizabeth Woodville, understanding what was happening, took her other children into sanctuary. Westminster Abbey was the medieval equivalent of a safe house, offering the church's protection. No secular authority could legally remove someone from sanctuary. Edward was lodged in the Tower of London on May 19th. The coronation, originally planned for May 4th, was postponed to June 25th, then postponed again, then never rescheduled. But something didn't make sense. The coronation preparations had been extensive, coins had been minted, knights had received letters ordering them to prepare. The entire machinery of state had been mobilized. You do not stop all of that for no reason. You do not leave a king uncrowned without a purpose. The purpose was becoming visible for those who knew where to look. On June 10th, Richard sent a letter to the city of York, asking for armed men. He described the Queen's family as enemies of the kingdom. He was requesting an army not to protect a coronation but to support what was coming next. On June 13th, something happened inside the Tower of London that shocked the court. A council meeting was taking place. Among those attending was Lord Hastings. Hastings had warned Richard about the Woodvilles and helped him consolidate power. He had been, until that point, Richard's ally. But Hastings was loyal to Edward IV's son. He would not support what Richard was now planning. During the meeting, Richard accused Hastings of treason. He gave him no time to respond, no opportunity to defend himself. Within minutes, he was beheaded in the courtyard of the tower. Not tried, not given an opportunity to speak, executed on the spot. The message this sent was unmistakable. If Hastings, a man of enormous power, could be killed that quickly and quietly, then no one was safe. No one who stood between Richard and what he wanted would be permitted to remain standing. 3 days later, Richard arranged for theologian Ralph Shaw to preach a sermon. The sermon declared that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid. The reason given was a pre-contract to marry Lady Eleanor Butler, made by Edward IV. If that pre-contract existed, then Edward IV had been effectively already betrothed. The marriage to Elizabeth was therefore bigamous, and the children of a bigamous marriage were illegitimate. Edward V, his brother Richard, his sisters, all of them illegitimate by law. That's when things changed completely. On the 25th of June, a gathering of lords, knights, and gentlemen, men who understood the direction of events and chose to align themselves with the man holding the swords, petitioned Richard to take the throne. Parliament formally endorsed the declaration of illegitimacy through an act called Titulus Regius, which means literally the title of the king. It was the legal document that took the crown from a 12-year-old boy and placed it on his uncle's head. On the 6th of July, 1483, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, was crowned King Richard III of England. The two boys in the Tower were no longer princes. They were no longer heirs. They held no title, no legal protection, no formal place in the kingdom that their uncle now ruled. They were two children behind stone walls, in a building now entirely controlled by the man who had displaced them. And after the summer of 1483, they were never seen again. Let us be precise about the last confirmed sightings, because precision matters here. Dominic Mancini was an Italian diplomat who had been in London during these events. He wrote a report of what he had witnessed, completed before November 1483. It is the only contemporary account of the princes written before Richard III's death. Every other detailed account was written afterward, under the Tudor dynasty with different political needs. Mancini's account is therefore the closest thing we have to an unfiltered view of what happened. Mancini wrote that after Richard III was crowned, the two princes were moved from the outer lodgings of the Tower, the relatively comfortable royal apartments, into the inner rooms, the White Tower, the part of the fortress where royal captives were traditionally held rather than housed. He noted that sightings of the boys in the gardens became increasingly rare. He wrote, with a careful diplomat's understatement, that he feared the boys were already dead before he left England. The Great Chronicle of London, written shortly after the events, noted that the two boys had been seen playing in the Tower Gardens in the weeks after Richard's coronation. Shooting arrows, walking in the yard, visible to people passing on the river. And then nothing. The sightings stopped. Without announcement, without explanation, without any official statement from the new king about the condition or whereabouts of his nephews. By autumn of 1483, rumors had spread across England and across the Channel into France and Burgundy. The rumors were specific. They said the boys had been murdered. They named the Tower as the place. They named suffocation as the method. Specific enough details that they came from someone who knew something, or claimed to know something, or had heard from someone who had been inside those walls. Richard III, now king, responded to these rumors with silence. He did not produce the boys in public to prove they were alive. This would have been easy, a formal appearance, a ceremony, a brief display to the court. It was done routinely with people who needed their survival confirmed. Richard never did it. He did not announce their deaths to explain their absence. He did not acknowledge the rumors. He simply governed, as though the question of two children's existence was beneath the notice of a reigning king. That silence told contemporaries everything they needed to know, even if it told historians nothing they could prove. Now, in October 1483, only 3 months after Richard took the throne, a rebellion broke out against him. It was led by Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, the same Buckingham who had been Richard's closest ally, the same man who had stood beside him through every stage of the coup, the same man who, according to at least one contemporary Portuguese document, had been named as the guardian of the princes inside the Tower. The rebellion failed. Buckingham was captured and executed in November 1483. He was beheaded in the marketplace at Salisbury. He was given no private audience with the king. Richard refused to see him. But the rebellion's trajectory carries a detail that most people miss when they tell this story. When the rebellion began, its stated purpose was to rescue Edward V, to free the young king from the Tower and restore him to the throne. That was the rallying call. That was the cause that drew men to Buckingham's banner. Midway through the rebellion, the aim shifted. The rebels stopped talking about restoring Edward V. They began instead to support Henry Tudor, a man living in exile in Brittany, with a relatively distant claim to the throne through a line of illegitimate descent. Why would men rallying to rescue a rightful king suddenly abandon that cause and pivot to a claimant with a far weaker blood, right? There is only one reason that makes sense. The rebels had received information, or reached a conclusion, that Edward V was already dead. You do not abandon the rescue of a living king. You only pivot to an alternative when the original cause no longer exists, which means that by October 1483, enough people close to the situation believed the princes were dead. And Buckingham, the man who had been their guardian, the man who was at the center of the rebellion, the man Richard refused to speak with before executing, may have known exactly what had happened, and why. And perhaps Richard refused the meeting because Buckingham knew too much to be allowed to say anything in front of witnesses. That is not evidence. It is logic applied to a pattern of behavior. But in the absence of confessions, logic applied to patterns of behavior is often all that history has to work with. For the next 2 years, Richard III ruled England. He governed with administrative competence. He passed laws, managed foreign relations, tried to stabilize a kingdom that had been shaken by decades of civil war. By the accounts of those in the north of England, where he had been known and respected as a lord before becoming king, he was a capable ruler, not a monster, but the shadow of the boys never left him. The rumors did not fade. They grew, more people repeated them. More men who had been loyal to Edward IV found themselves unable to align with the king who had taken the throne from his nephew. The support that Richard needed from southern England, from the powerful families who had served the Yorkist cause under Edward IV, never fully materialized. The belief that he had murdered 2 children sat in the court like something unspoken at every meal, visible in every careful pause before a name was mentioned. And in August 1485, on a field in Leicestershire called Bosworth, Henry Tudor led an army against Richard III and defeated him. Richard died in the battle. It was the last time a reigning English king was killed in combat on English soil. He was 32 years old. He had ruled for 2 years and 2 months. Henry Tudor became king. Henry VII, the Tudor dynasty began, and with that change of dynasty came something that is critical to understanding the story of the princes and the control of the narrative. Henry VII had his own reasons to want Richard III remembered as a murderer. A king who kills children is a king whose overthrow is not just justified but morally necessary. Henry needed his victory at Bosworth to feel like a rescue, not just a conquest. He needed Richard to be the villain, clearly and completely. The writers who produced the most detailed accounts of the prince's fate wrote under the Tudors. Polydore Virgil wrote under Henry VII. Thomas More wrote his vivid, detailed account under Henry VIII. These men were not neutral. They were writing in an environment where the official position was that Richard III had been a tyrant, and his removal from history's good graces was a political necessity. Thomas More's account is the most famous. It describes the murder in precise detail. 2 men, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, entered the prince's chamber at midnight. They found the boys sleeping. They pressed pillows and feather bedding over the boys' faces and held them down until the children stopped moving. They then buried the bodies at the foot of a staircase inside the tower, covered with stones. Later, according to Moore, Richard had the bodies moved to a location that Dighton could not specify. Moore said this account came from Dighton himself, one of the alleged killers, who had confessed to it. He also said that Sir James Tyrrell, the man claimed to have organized the killing on Richard's orders, had confessed under torture before his execution in 1502 for an unrelated treasonous act. But Tyrrell's confession was never published. No transcript survives. No independent source confirms what exactly he said. We have Moore's description of a confession that no one else seems to have seen, written 30 years after the events by a man who was a child when they occurred. This does not mean Moore invented it entirely. He had access to people who were alive in 1483. He could have heard accounts passed through trusted intermediaries. His information may have been real, reshaped by time and politics. Or it may have been a framework of suspicion dressed in invented detail to serve the Tudor story. That ambiguity is precisely what the people responsible intended. When history is written by those who won, the truth does not need to be fabricated entirely. It only needs to be made unverifiable. If every account that supports the official story was written by people with a reason to support it, and every witness who might have contradicted it was dead or silenced, then the official story stands not because it is proven, but because nothing else can be proven either. Then came 1674, and things changed again. King Charles II was on the throne. A different England, a different century, 200 years removed from 1483. The White Tower was being renovated. Workers were demolishing an old Tudor staircase to make way for a new structure. They dug down into the foundations. 10 feet below the base of the staircase, their shovels struck wood. A chest. Inside the chest were the bones of 2 children, Small bones, old bones, delicate. The workers set them aside at first, uncertain what they were looking at. As the discovery was examined more closely, the sizes of the remains became clear. 2 children, different ages. The older set of bones consistent with a child of approximately 12 to 13 years. The younger consistent with a child of approximately 9 to 10 years. The ages of the princes. Inside the Tower of London, buried under a staircase, Thomas More had written 160 years earlier that the princes had been buried at the foot of some stairs. He had said it based on a confession he claimed to have received from one of the killers, and now there were bones, in exactly that location. Charles II ordered the remains interred in Westminster Abbey. A white marble urn was commissioned, designed by Sir Christopher Wren, the same architect rebuilding London after the Great Fire. The urn was placed in the Henry VII Chapel, near the tomb of Elizabeth I. The inscription declared the bones to be the relics of Edward V and his brother Richard. The matter appeared, to many people, to be settled, but it was not settled, not even close. In 1933, the bones were re-examined by a team of experts. The examination concluded that the remains were consistent with the ages of the 2 princes. But the technology of 1933 could not determine sex with certainty. It could not establish precise date of death. It found animal bones mixed among the human remains, raising questions about how the burial was disturbed or contaminated over time. And the conclusion, though widely reported as confirmation, was never definitive by the standards that modern forensic science requires. Since then, every decade has seen renewed calls to open the urn, extract material, and conduct DNA testing. The boy's ancestry is documented well enough that genetic material from verified descendants of Edward IV could be compared against the remains. The technology exists. The question could be answered, at least in part. The permission has never been granted. Buckingham Palace, speaking for the royal family, has declined every request. The reasons given center on the sanctity of royal burial sites and the importance of allowing the dead their rest. These reasons are not unreasonable by themselves, but they are also the reasons given by an institution that would be directly implicated in the outcome of any test that confirmed the identity of murdered royal children. The monarchy that currently sits on the English throne traces its lineage through the family that displaced Edward V. The bones in Westminster Abbey represent an uncomfortable question for a very old institution, and so the most direct path to the truth remains blocked, not by conspiracy, by policy, by the kind of institutional caution that produces the same result as deliberate suppression without requiring anyone to make that choice openly. Now, the suspects, because the story is not finished with Richard III's death. Richard is the obvious answer, and for many historians the most likely one. He had the boys in his custody. He controlled the building they were in. He had clear motive. As long as they lived, they could be used by his enemies as the legitimate center of any rebellion against him. The rebellion of October 1483 had already tried exactly that, and when Richard never produced the boys to prove they were alive, his contemporaries drew the conclusion that their disappearance intended them to draw. But there are problems with Richard as the sole and certain answer. The first is political logic. Richard had already declared the boys illegitimate through Parliament. Legally, they had no claim to the throne. Keeping them alive but powerless and imprisoned would have been safe. Killing them and having that killing become known, which it clearly did within months, created exactly the crisis that damaged his reign and ultimately contributed to its end. Richard was ruthless, but he was not stupid. Would he have done something that stupid? Some historians say yes, that fear is not rational, and that even intelligent men can make catastrophically bad decisions when they feel their grip on power loosening. Others say the question itself suggests Richard may not have been responsible. The second suspect is Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham. He was named guardian of the princes in at least one contemporary document. He had access to the tower in a way that very few people did. He had ambitions that historians are still trying to fully understand. He was Richard's closest ally in the coup, and then he turned against Richard with a speed and completeness that suggests something happened between them, something serious enough to transform an ally into an enemy in 3 months. One theory is that Buckingham killed the boys on his own initiative, without Richard's explicit order, perhaps to please the king, perhaps to remove a problem he saw as threatening, perhaps as part of a plan to position himself for future power, and that when Richard discovered what had happened, or when the political fallout made it clear that the murder would destroy them both, the relationship between the two men collapsed. If Buckingham killed the princes without Richard's sanction, it would explain why Richard refused to see him before his execution. It would explain why Buckingham moved so quickly against a king he had just helped create. And it would explain why the story was never told cleanly, because neither man could tell the truth without implicating himself. The third suspect is the one history has been most reluctant to examine seriously, perhaps because he is the one who won. Henry Tudor became Henry VII. He had motive to want the princes dead that predated his arrival in England. As long as Edward V and his brother Richard were alive, even illegitimate, even imprisoned, they were Yorkist heirs with stronger blood claims than his own. If they ever escaped or were rescued, or had their legitimacy restored by a friendly parliament, Henry's claim collapsed. Every day they lived was a vulnerability in his hold on power. Henry VII ruled for 24 years. In those 24 years, he dealt with multiple pretenders who claimed to be one or the other of the missing princes. Lambert Simnel appeared in 1487, claiming to be Edward, the older prince or possibly a cousin. Perkin Warbeck appeared in 1491 and claimed for years to be Prince Richard, the younger brother. Both were dismissed as impostors by Henry's government. Simnel was captured after a battle and set to work in the royal kitchens, an unusually lenient response that some historians find curious. Warbeck was captured, imprisoned in the Tower, and eventually executed in 1499. Henry VII's response to these pretenders was not consistent with a man who simply knew they were frauds. A man who knows the princes are dead and knows exactly how and when they died can say so. Henry never said so. He never produced evidence of their deaths. He never explained their fate. He took the throne and governed as if the question were settled, while spending years and considerable resources hunting men who claimed to be the princes he never acknowledged were dead. That does not make him the killer, but it places him, like Richard before him, inside a pattern of behavior more consistent with guilt or knowledge than with innocence. And then, in 2023, something was found in the National Archives that sent a quiet but significant tremor through the community of historians who had spent their careers on this question. A researcher examining 16th century wills came across a document dated 1516. It was the will of a woman named Lady Margaret Capel. She was the half-sister of the wife of Sir James Tyrrell, the same Tyrrell whom Thomas More had named as the man who organized the prince's murder on Richard's orders. The same Tyrrell who was executed in 1502 and who allegedly confessed to the killings before his death. In a confession no one has ever been able to verify. In her will, Lady Margaret Capel left a possession to her son. She described it as his father's chain, and she identified its original owner in writing, in a document preserved in the National Archives for 500 years, as, and these are her words, the young King Edward V, a personal chain, a piece of jewelry worn by a 12-year-old boy, found, 33 years after that boy disappeared, in the possession of the family of the man accused of killing him. Objects do not confess. They do not explain themselves. A chain can pass through many hands for many reasons over 30 years. But this chain was not described as a trophy acquired at market or a gift from a merchant. It was described as something personal, the boy's own chain identified by his name and his title, in the hands of a family with a documented connection to the most significant royal murder accusation in English history. The discovery does not close the case. Nothing closes this case. That is the nature of it. The evidence is always present, always suggestive, always just short of definitive. But it adds to a picture that becomes harder to explain away with each new document. Someone in Tyrrell's family had Edward V's chain. Tyrrell had confessed allegedly to organizing his death. Tyrrell's confession was never published. Tyrrell was dead, and a chain belonging to the boy he was accused of killing sat in his family's possession for decades, passed down as though it were simply an heirloom, and then appeared in a will as though its history were unremarkable. History leaves its traces in unexpected places. That is the lesson of this story, told again and again across 5 centuries. In 1483, a king's bones were considered safely gone, buried without record, without marker, their location known only to the men who put them there. In 2012, archaeologists excavating a car park in Leicester found those bones beneath the tarmac. The bones of Richard III himself, identified by DNA, positively matched to a known descendant, buried in secrecy, found 500 years later in a parking lot. Even kings do not stay hidden. Edward V was 12 years old. He had been king for 77 days, from the death of his father in April to the parliamentary declaration of illegitimacy in late June. He had never been crowned. He had never sat in formal judgment, never signed an order that became law, never made a single decision as a reigning monarch. His entire reign was consumed by the machinery of his removal. He was a child who was about to become powerful. So he was removed before that could happen. His brother, 9 years old, young enough that he may not have fully understood what was happening around him, was removed alongside him. Because a younger brother with a legitimate claim is still a claim, and claims do not become safe merely because their holder is a child. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, lived until 1492. She knew things she never committed to surviving record. She made peace with Richard III in March 1484, less than a year after her sons disappeared, and brought her daughters out of sanctuary to live at court. This has been used by some as evidence that she did not believe Richard had killed the boys, because no mother would negotiate with her son's killer. But that argument assumes Elizabeth had options. She did not. She was a woman with no income, no protection, no legal standing outside the sanctuary that Richard could have pressured the church to revoke at any time. She had daughters who needed futures, marriages, dowries, lives. She had no army. She had no allies willing to move against the king on her behalf. She had nothing except the political reality that accommodation with Richard was the only path that kept her daughters alive and eventually married. She accommodated. That is not evidence of Richard's innocence. It is evidence of how little power she had. Elizabeth Woodville died in a convent in 1492, 7 years after Richard III was killed at Bosworth, in the reign of the Tudor king who had married her eldest daughter. She left no account of what she knew or believed about her sons. If she wrote anything down, it has not survived. The silence of the people closest to this story is one of its most consistent features. Elizabeth Woodville was silent. Richard III was silent. Henry VII was silent. The men who carried out whatever was done inside the tower were either dead before anyone could compel them to speak, or spoke only in circumstances controlled by kings. That is how power manages truth. Not always by burying it, sometimes simply by ensuring that no one with the authority to act on it is ever in the position to hear it cleanly. The bones of 2 children are in Westminster Abbey in a white marble urn, designed by the architect who rebuilt London after the Great Fire. They have been there for 3.5 centuries. They may be the prince's. They may not be. No one has been allowed to determine which. A chain that belonged to Edward. He sat in a family's possession for over 30 years after his disappearance and ended up in a will in 1516. It spent the next 500 years in an archive before someone looked at it carefully enough to understand what they were reading. Documents are still being found. Researchers are still working. The Missing Princes Project, a serious modern investigative effort using cold case methodology, has found continental documents suggesting that one or both princes may have survived their uncle's reign and attempted to reclaim their thrones. The elder appearing as a claimant at the Battle of Stoke in 1487, the younger as Perkin Warbeck in the 1490s. Most mainstream historians find this evidence provocative but not conclusive. The debate continues. The mystery continues because the truth was never fully buried. It was only made difficult to reach, placed in documents that required the right language to read, in bones that required the right permission to test, in objects that required centuries of patience before the connection between them and the crime became visible. Edward V and his brother Richard were placed inside the Tower of London by the man who then took their throne. They were declared illegitimate by a parliament assembled under pressure from that man's armed supporters. The people who might have protected them were executed before they could act. The people who might have spoken after were silenced or dead, and the king who came after, who had his own reasons to want the question permanently unanswered, shaped the historical record that reached the centuries that followed. This is the story of the princes in the tower, not a story of a mystery too old to understand, a story of a truth too dangerous to confirm, dangerous enough that the institution most capable of resolving it has chosen, again and again, to leave the urn sealed and the bones untested. Power buries what it cannot afford to acknowledge. But 500 years of history have shown, in case after case, that what power buries does not stay buried. It waits in archives, in wills, in bones beneath staircases, in chains passed down through families who may not have understood what they were holding. Two boys entered the Tower of London in the summer of 1483. The truth about what happened to them is still inside those walls, in one form or another, waiting for someone to finally open